In this discussion, we shall be concerned with the different phases of the revolutionary movement. We had some idea about how, during the later stages of the Swadesi movement, in the absence of a mass mobilization, the Swadesi militancy ultimately found refuge in revolutionary terrorist action, where the emphasis was on exemplary individual acts of terror in order to arouse a measure of consciousness among the people about the need to start a major upsurge, an armed revolution against British rule. That was the way Aurobindo Ghosh actually had visualized the significance of this cult of violence. But as we know, that even after the partition was annulled, the heroic self-sacrifice of the terrorist actually lived in the minds of the people, and several different other phases followed later during the war years between 1914-15. Then you have another bout of terrorist activity or revolutionary activity during the 1920s, and lastly during the 1930s.
So, was there any distinct trends in each of these four phases?
Certainly. I will explain this elaborately as we go on. But just to respond to your question and briefly anticipate the arguments that will follow, the plan for an armed revolution was sought to be implemented through connections that the revolutionaries wished to forge with the armed forces. That happened during the second phase of the movement. In the third phase, as I said, there was an importation of the socialist rhetoric into their activity. The kind of religiosity that you come across among the earlier secret societies was gradually giving way to a new kind of awareness about the need to invent a secular political language. And as you come to the last phase during the 1930s, against the backdrop of the civil disobedience campaign undertaken by Gandhi in April 1930, which, as you know, it started with the Salt March, it was in this context that you come across a certain kind of militant action in Chittagong, where women became prominent. So you have distinct phases, and not distinct simply because they came one after another. It is a temporal distinction, but you also see new trends in revolutionary movement. From 1930s onwards, we see a definitive turn to Marxism, but that is another story. If we actually go back to the first phase, about which we had said a few words in the discussion on Swadesi already, you are all familiar with the history of how the Anushilan party was formed on the basis of an pre-existing physical culture movement which tried to indoctrinate the Bengali youth with the cult of manliness. The underlying idea was that in order to contain imperialism, these Bengalis, who had been often inferiorized by the British as effeminate people, need to acquire physical strength. And this physical culture movement spawned a number of societies, one of which was Anushilan. Ultimately, this Anushilan group split into small branches, and one of these was the Dhaka Anushilan Samiti, which had a number of branches all over the district of Eastern Bengal. And you have in Calcutta the Jugantar party emerging around the nucleus of the weekly paper Jugantar. So you have two identifiable groups among the revolutionaries, the Jugantar and the Anushilan group, and within the Anushilan group you have the Dhaka Anushilan Samiti, which eventually became the most important Anushilan outfit among the revolutionaries. If you look at the organization of these secret groups or these societies which were involved more directly in revolutionary activity, these were usually clustered around what the British documents describe as dadas. You have mentors who would recruit young students as volunteers in these societies. These dadas or the mentors would indoctrinate them with the cult of violence, and through such processes an organizational network was emerging, although it was not very tightly knit. Consequently, you come across a lack of coordination among the many societies that had mushroomed all over eastern Bengal. Comparatively, the number of such societies was smaller in western Bengal, but even there you don't come across the kind of coordination that was required in order to build up the situation for a coordinated, concerted revolutionary action. In comparison to the organizations or the outfits that functioned in West Bengal, the East Bengal outfits were more well knit. I mean, not so well knit as to create a revolutionary organization on a massive scale, but the linkages between the different branches of the Dhaka Anushoolan group spread all over the eastern districts were more intimate. Pulin Das and his associates were able to exert a certain amount of central control over these branch organizations. Despite such weaknesses, and despite the fact that with repressive laws, many of the terrorist activities began to abate from the turn of the decade, despite the fact that the annulment of the partition in 1911 sought to curb this revolutionary militancy through the kind of concession that the government came to offer to the Bengali nationalists by reuniting the province again, revolutionary militancy continued. It came back once again around 1914-1915 with onset of the war. These revolutionaries wished to take advantage of the war situation, the weaknesses of the British Empire, the extraordinary situation that was created by the war with Germany, and in an attempt to lend greater strength to this revolutionary movement, they wanted to forge links with the Germans on the one hand and with revolutionaries elsewhere in the world, revolutionaries or Indian nationalists who were residents of Southeast Asia or the American coast in Germany. Many of these revolutionaries had gone on exile to Germany. They had formed the Indian Independence Committee in Berlin. You have the Ghaddarite movement in western coast of United States and centered around San Francisco. What is remarkable is that the headquarters of the Ghaddarites in San Francisco was called the Jugantar House. So, and the man behind this initiative was an Oxford graduate, Hardayal, a Punjabi, who had been exposed to the extremist movement in the Punjab. And in San Francisco, Hardayal, through the organization of Ghadar, the name Ghadar is derived from the name of the newspaper, implying rebellion, that Hardayal and his associates were publishing from San Francisco. Hardayal was preaching among the Sikh residents of the region and also in the western part of Canada, asking them to return to India to participate in an armed revolution against the British. So you have a sort of militant movement taking place among the Indian settlers abroad, particularly in the United States. You have, on the other hand, the functioning of the Indian Independence Committee in Berlin. The connections were established between the Ghaddarites and the Indian Independence Committee, and together they were trying to use the German Channel for importation of arms to India. So you can see clearly a very important development on the earlier brand of militancy, which was limited to exemplary individual acts. In the second phase, there was a certain move towards the implementation of this vision of an armed revolution on a more elaborate scale by importing arms, by linking up with the Germans, by linking up with the revolutionaries or the Indian nationalists settled abroad who were expected to mobilize resources in order to buy arms and ammunitions for the revolutionaries here. So in 1914, one important incident actually charged the Ghaddarites. It's known as the Komagata Maru incident in Bajbaj. There was a riotous situation at these ship, Komagata Maru, anchored at Bajbaj, and these people who were actually moving from one port to another, who was expected to land at Vancouver, and they were refused entry into Vancouver. They moved from Vancouver to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong they came to Calcutta. in order to go to Punjab. So, this Komagata Maru incident was certainly a very important event.
Sir, what is the importance of this Komagata Maru incident?
Yes, in the first place, the event itself was a shocking event because these Punjabis, the Sheikhs mainly, who landed at Bajbaj, became involved in a riot, and many of them were killed because of police firing. And many others actually traveled to Punjab. And by way of preaching sedition among the Punjabi army men, they actually started plotting for an army revolt. Even the date was fixed. 15 February, these army men at Firozpur, at Rawalpindi, they were expected to rise in rebellion against the British authorities. This didn't actually come through because the intelligence was able to uncover the plot. But as you see clearly that the movement did no longer remain limited. It was moving out. It was affecting others. There was a clear indication of how through such links that some of the revolutionaries had been able to establish an armed revolt was figuring on the agenda. Now, this was the Komagata Maru incident and the consequent planning for an armed revolt using the disgruntled Ghadarites, using the Ghadarite link with the Punjab in order to motivate armed forces to rise in arms against the British. There was a parallel initiative in Bengal as well, largely by the Jugantar group, now under the leadership of a man called Jatin Mukherjee. Bagha Jatin, as he was called. Jatin with the strength of a tiger. Now, Jatin Mukherjee and the Jugantar party depended on some of their agents who had already left India and had gone to Southeast Asia. Narendranath Bhattacharya, who later on became Manobendranath Rai and became converted to Marxism, and one of the architects of the Indian Communist Party in the earliest stage, when this party was, an Indian Communist Party was formed in Tashkent in 1921. Now, before he became Manobendranath Rai, he was associated with the Jugantar Party, went to the Southeast Asia, went to Singapore and traveled around Southeast Asia in order to ensure, through German channels, importation of arms and ammunition, which the Jugantar Party wished to use in order once again to start a more elaborate kind of an armed revolution. Once again, as you know, there were several attempts by Narendranath Bhattacharya or Abani Mukherjee or Rashbihari Bose, who in the meanwhile had gone to Japan. Rashbihari Bose himself was involved, along with Sachindranath Sannal, and Bengali immigrant in Benares, in the attempt on Hardinge's life in 1912. It misfired, and Rashbihari Bose ultimately fled to Japan. Sachindranath Sannal, who was accused of preaching sedition among the armed forces, armed cantonments at Danapur and Benares, was deported. But these are examples of how the movement was trying to acquire greater strength by way of importing arms, by way of establishing links with others elsewhere in the world, with the Ghadarites, using the Ghadarite influence in the Punjab to preach sedition among the army. And Jatin Mukherjee's initiative came around the same time when he was planning this armed revolt against the British by depending on the consignment of arms that Naren Bhattacharya and Abani Mukherjee were expected to send to India. The ship called Maverick was expected to carry these arms to the coast of Orissa, but ultimately this was uncovered. The ship laden with arms and ammunition never arrived. Jatin Mukherjee had to die the martyr's death on the bank of Buribalam, and that has become an important memory of the great revolutionary initiative taken by one of the great martyrs in the history of this country. People of later generations recounted these heroic deeds of men like Jyotirnath Mukherjee. After this second phase, the movement was severely repressed by the Defence of India rules, by a large variety of repressive measures that the government had taken. It had appointed Justice Rowlatt's committee. It is known as the Sedition Committee. The Sedition Committee was expected to recommend even more repressive measures to curb revolutionary militancy or revolutionary violence. So, in the face of the repression, there was a temporary stoppage to such activities, the kind of promise that the militancy of the early part of the decade had shown to some extent frittered away. As we come to the third phase, we come across a somewhat different political scenario in the early part of the 1920s. With the Gandhian movement, the nationalist movement moved in a new direction. Peasants became involved. There was a certain resurgence of mass nationalism. And it is in this context when many of these revolutionaries found repression very hard, they began to use the Congress cover. Many of them became involved in the Congress organizations. In Bengal, in many of the district Congress committees, the revolutionaries or the former revolutionaries who had their commitment to their revolutionary vision became associated with the Congress. So it is in this kind of a context you have to locate this third phase of the revolutionary movement.
So did Gandhian movement had any impact on this revolutionary movement?
If there was an ideological impact, I don't find much. Even though it is possible to suggest that many of the revolutionaries of the first generation would begin to live a more quiet life. They would discard the cult of violence and would try to assimilate within the mainstream politics. But the ideological appeal of nonviolence didn't cut much ice among those who had already been committed to a certain kind of violent movement or a violent revolution against the British. We all know that this appeal of nonviolence generally in Bengal was not so striking. You have their differences between Gandhi and C.R. Das. In Chittaranjan Das, the Bengalis found their own hero, and C.R. Das maintained connections with these revolutionaries who became involved in the Congress movement. So we come across a situation where many of the Anushilan party activists became quiet or adopted a more quiet posture, while the Jugantar party activists became increasingly associated in the Congress with the Swarajya party of Chittaranjan Das in particular, and later on many of the offshoots of the Jugantar party functioning through different kinds of organizations, all of these became associated in the Congress and also in the factional politics of the Congress. This was one development among the revolutionaries that we come across in the backdrop of the non-cooperation movement. But what requires to be stressed is that the failure of the non-cooperation or the withdrawal of the non-cooperation created a certain degree of disillusionment in which we come across once again the trend towards militant action. We see around the middle of the decade several initiatives, several dacoities committed by the Swadeshi militants in order to procure money for purchase of arms, for building organizations, etc. But what is remarkable about this third phase is that these Bengal revolutionaries, some of their compatriots who had been settlers in North India, in Benares, we have the example of Sachindranath Sannal, you have Ajay Ghosh from North India once again. These who had been initially indoctrinated with these ideas had been able to establish links with the local population. And the outcome became very remarkable in Punjab. Sachin Sannal had formed the Hindustan Republican Army, which had discarded the old religiosity of the first generation revolutionaries and adopted a more secular and socialist posture, considering that the final objective of this revolutionary initiative was to achieve an egalitarian nation in India. And one of the consequences of this was the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army. This was established in 1928 by Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh, of course, was one of them. You have Batukeshwar Datta and a few others. Sachindranath Sannal's brother was also associated with this initiative. They imported into this revolutionary movement, this militant movement, a socialist rhetoric and also atheist to some extent.
Excuse me, sir, were there only Hindus involved in the revolutionary movements?
Generally so. I mean, you have the Sikhs also becoming involved in this revolutionary initiative from the second decade of the 20th century. But we also come across a few Muslim militants who were plotting a revolution from their exile at Kabul. These people were protagonists of Khilafat. They had become extremely hostile to the British for their maltreatment of the Turkish Caliph, and because of this they became involved also in the non-cooperation movement. You have some instances of Muslim leaders being infected by this kind of militancy, particularly because of this Khilafat issue. But generally, if you look at the composition of the different militant groups in India, you don't come across a large number of them. As you come to the fourth phase in the 1930s, once again at the backdrop of this initiative towards civil disobedience campaign, one of the most important terrorist outrages in early April synchronized with Gandhi's Salt March. And the man who was actually leading the Salt March at Chittagong was responsible for the armory raid. He was the leader of that group who conducted that armory raid in the hills of Chittagong. And he was a congressman. He was a very important functionary of the Congress organization in the district. Master Ashud Hussain was a congressman. So he was leading people into military action in order to procure arms by an armory raid. And you are all familiar with the heroic story of how many of them died during that armed encounter with the military and the police. And as you see the mobilization by the revolutionaries during this phase, you come across a very distinctive development of the Greater Association of Women. Pritilata Waddadar, who had been assigned the responsibility of leading a second assault on the Jalalabad hills by Surja Sen, was one very notable example, but you have many others as well. So in the 1930s, many of these revolutionaries went through a period of introspection and eventually became converted to Marxism, which was a different story, and we shall talk about it on a later occasion. The turn to leftism, something which we come across among the revolutionaries during the later part of the 1920s, became crystallized in the course of the 1930s. As I was saying, that they had a period of introspection, as a consequence of which they began to make a reassessment of the methods that they had pursued earlier. And along with this came a different kind of reassessment of the kind of political language that the first generation revolutionaries had used, embedded as this language was in religiosity. Bhupendranath Datta, for example, questioned the wisdom of using a language that was alienating large sections of the non-Hindu population. Hemchandra Kanungo, another first generation revolutionary who also went through a period of reassessment of the kind of political language that they had used. So from 1920s, the Hindustan Republican Army or the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army of Bhagat Singh, the manner they imported into the politics of the revolution is a new political language, certainly in my opinion, one of the major turning points in the history of the revolutionary movement. Sachindranath Sannal, for example, in a pamphlet of 1925, almost anticipating Bhagat Singh, continued to adhere to the cult of violence, continued to talk about the need for the individuals to participate in these outrages in order to set heroic examples before the Indians. But while at the same time, Sannal himself suggested that these needed to be blended with large-scale mobilization of peasant and labor. So at last, these revolutionaries felt that only individual action was not going to suffice. There was a need for the revolutionaries to undertake a greater mobilization of the peasants and labor. So that was a distinct trend of the 1920s. Alongside the kind of individual acts of bravery and heroism that you come across in Bengal, you have this famous Binoy Badal Dinesh incident, which was basically a charge on the writers' building by these three heroes during this phase. Women were coming into this movement in greater number. You have this great example in Calcutta of Bina Das trying to shoot that lieutenant governor during a Calcutta University convocation. From the close of the 1920s, we come across that many of these students who were drawn into the nationalist movement through organizations like Chhatra Sangho or Chhatri Sangho. This was a development that had started around the early part of the 1920s, reaching a climax towards the close of the decade when student organizations began to proliferate, and among them you come across Chhatra Sangho and Chhatri Sangho. And these were actually associations with which many of the revolutionaries became involved, and through these outfits we come across the greater involvement of women, female students. Then, as she went back to her hometown at Chittagong, she was chosen by Surya Sen as one of the leading figures in the small group that he was leading at Chittagong. So, you can see how revolutionary movement also began to absorb certain changes that had started affecting national movement generally. The greater mobilization of the masses, the spread of nationalism among the peasants, the gradual emergence of the left. It is against this backdrop that you figure some very important developments in the revolutionary movement, which is the backdrop to what I am actually describing as the introspection among the revolutionaries about the right kind of revolutionary path which inescapably demanded mobilization of the people.